evening. Thank you for coming out on this wet night. We're very excited about this program. For those of you who are aware, we are in the process of planning for a large commemoration that's coming down the pipe, which is the 250th of the American Revolution. So those of us in this building at the State Museum, State Archives, State Library, as well as colleagues around the state, local historians, the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, we're all thinking deeply about how do we commemorate this massive event in a way that is inclusive and honest to the history. So it's very exciting for us to bring this program forward and have this public program in person with Michael Hattem. I just want to make a couple announcements before I bring Dr. Hattem up. Those of you who are looking for CTLE credits, teachers, there's two ways you can do it. There's a form there, or there's a barcode that you can scan. And that includes those who are going to be viewing this on our YouTube channel. So go ahead and download those items and take a look at that. I also want to mention that this is part of New York State History Month. That's another exciting part of this presentation. October is History Month. We celebrate the work of historians during this month of all types, academic historians and local government historians, public historians. So this is an official State History Month event, and we have one more public program in line for next week, which is a talk with historian Pedro A. Rigodalgo, excuse me for mispronouncing that, and his talk is on the bodega, place, urban redevelopment, and political power in post-war New York. So that will be next Thursday, same place, 7 p.m. All right, I'd like to welcome Dr. Michael Hattem to the podium tonight. Michael is an American historian, an author of Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution, which was published in 2020. He received his PhD from Yale University and has taught at Knox College in Illinois and the New School in New York City. He is currently Associate Director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. His work has been supported by such institutions as the American Philosophical Society, the New York Historical Society, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and the Library Company, and has been mentioned in such mainstream publications as the New York Times and Time. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you, everyone. I want to start by thanking Devin and Aaron and Lauren and the rest of the team here at the State Museum for inviting me to speak on this unfortunately wet evening. My talk tonight is going to be based on a book that I am currently finishing that is entitled The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. And it is basically a history of how Americans have fought over the meaning and the legacy of the revolution from the very beginning of the nation to the turn of the 21st century. And, part of this is based on the notion that it can be rather easy to think that, how we understand the revolution today is how Americans have more or less always understood the revolution. But nothing could be further from the truth. And how Americans have understood the legacy and the meaning of the revolution really has changed over time quite dramatically and has always been shaped by contemporary circumstances and contexts. We can see clearly just in the past few years how the revolution continues to have quite special resonance in the American imagination and in our political culture, from the Tea Party in 2010, the Hamilton musical in 2015, the recent controversies over the 1619 Project, and even the prominent use of revolutionary symbolism at the Capitol on January 6th. This unique hold that the revolution has on the American imagination really dates back to the very beginning of the nation in the late 18th century, but its origins go back even further to a pre-revolutionary cultural inheritance from Britain. And in the 18th century, many British subjects believed that the best way for any powerful empire to temporarily forestall its sort of inevitable decline, because they thought that history worked cyclically, that the best way to do that was by recommitting to what they called first principles. Now, for Britons in the 18th century and American colonists, that meant the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But in the 18th century, a revolution did not mean what it's come to mean, which is a sort of fundamental break with the past, but rather it suggested a return to some earlier point, a full revolution. And so since independence, Americans have looked for and found their first principles in the American Revolution. And the fights that we have had over the meaning and the legacy of the Revolution for the last 250 years really have been in no small part about defining those first principles. For example, is the first principle of the Declaration of Independence liberty or equality? Is the legacy, did the Constitution create a republic or a democracy? And is the legacy of the Revolution to be found in acts of resistance, like the Declaration, or a commitment to law and order, like the Constitution? So whether Americans are aware of it or not, we have inherited and really intensified this notion that there is a kind of protection in looking back to our national origins and recommitting ourselves to the first principles of the nation's founding. And I think this helps explain, at least in part, why so many Americans often wonder what the founders would have thought about something happening in the present, and why Americans have always seen such high stakes in their fights over the Revolution. And so throughout American history, the memory of the Revolution has really been one of the most important tools for defining the nation's first principles. The Revolution's importance in American culture is also derived from its role as an origin story, right? Origin stories are central to a nation's identity, to its sense of patriotism. Societies create origin myths to explain how they came to be and to convey their first principles. So for generations, how many Americans have understood the basic story of the Revolution roughly follows the narrative structure of the famous hero's journey, which was quite common in ancient mythology, and even in more recent times in such popular films as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. So the standard narrative of the Revolution, so it goes, first, the hero or heroes are faced with a call to adventure. In the 1760s, when Britain begins taking greater control over the colonies, after committing to resist Britain's reforms, the heroes then descend into the world of the unknown by declaring independence, where they go through numerous challenges and temptations throughout the war for independence. During these challenges, the heroes are aided by a helper, in this case, France. The end of the war leads to the climactic process of death and rebirth, in which former colonists secure independence and are reborn as Americans. They then go through the process of transformation in the 1780s, but reach the point of atonement as they realize that the Articles of Confederation are not working. And finally, they are given the gift of the goddess, in this case, the Constitution, before returning to the ordinary world where they had started. Now, that the traditional narrative of the Revolution has often been depicted and understood along these very familiar lines, I think helps us to better understand Americans' emotional attachment to the Revolution and says something about its sort of underlying power in defining American patriotism. But unlike many ancient origins myths, whose intended meanings were often clear, the meaning of the Revolution has always been contested and has changed significantly over time. But how can a historical event have so many different meanings, especially across what can be a rather wide political spectrum? I want to suggest a few reasons for the malleability of the memory of the revolution and to try to understand how it can be adopted so widely across our political spectrum. First, the memory of the revolution, like the memory of most events, is rooted not in facts, but in meaning. Of course, it's very easy for citizens, like historians, to look at a collection of facts or documents and find different meanings in them. Second, the revolution is itself seemingly contradictory in several ways. It was a revolution driven partly by colonists' conservative desire to preserve their British rights, but it was also a revolution that was built on a rhetoric of liberty, generated in part by men whose fortunes came from slavery. These inherent contradictions, I think, have actually made it easier for Americans of very different political persuasions to identify with and find meaning in the revolution. And then third, and this is really going to be the crux of the talk tonight, the revolution produced two critical founding documents that contribute to its flexibility in public memory. The Declaration of Independence, with its radical ideas about equality and the right of resistance, and the Constitution, which was partly brought about by a conservative reaction against the popular democratic spirit that the revolution had unleashed. So the fact that the nation has these two founding documents of such fundamentally different characters really has played a critical role in why Americans of each generation and across the political spectrum have been able to claim the revolution for their own and for their specific political agendas. And the many, many ways that Americans have understood the revolution as a whole has been to a very significant extent defined by the ways that they have understood the meaning of these two documents, and especially which document they have thought was the most fundamental expression of the first principles of the revolution. And so that's going to be the basis of the rest of this talk, to focus on how Americans' understandings of these two documents have changed over time, how they've been influenced by contemporary circumstances, and how they affect how Americans understand the revolution as a whole. So many Americans think of the Declaration today as a statement about the importance of individual liberty and equality, but that's really not how Americans in the 18th and 19th centuries thought of it. In the decades immediately after the Revolution, the Declaration mostly symbolized independence and union. But there were a few early exceptions. This is Lemuel Haynes, who was born in 1753 in Connecticut to a white mother and a black father. After completing a period of indentured servitude, he became a Minuteman and later participated in the seizure of Fort Ticonderoga with Ethan Allen. Now, immediately after the Declaration became sort of public knowledge, Haynes began connecting the patriot cause with that of enslaved persons. In 1776, he wrote a pamphlet entitled Liberty Further Extended that seems to be the first time that the Declaration's statement about equality, all men are created equal, and the quote about the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were actually quoted from the Declaration of Independence. In this pamphlet, he wrote that liberty is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white one, and bondage as equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other. Haynes later became an ordained minister and actually was the first black man to preach to a white congregation in the United States. And so from what we can tell, this biracial minister was one of the first Americans to begin the canonization of the preamble of the Declaration of Independence and assert that its statement about equality was the principal meaning of the revolution. Now, in the 1830s, abolitionists begin to change the popular memory of the revolution and the meaning of the Declaration. So abolitionists really routinely quoted the Declaration of Independence in making their case for abolition, emancipation, and enfranchisement. And we can see that in the very first issue of William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator from 1831. In the paper's mission statement, you can see he explains the symbolism of publishing the newspaper in Boston when he writes, "I determined at every hazard to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty." He continued by saying, assenting to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population. Now, as Northern abolitionists embraced the Declaration, some Southerners, perhaps many, responded by dismissing the Declaration of Independence. In 1835, the Christian Herald dismissed what they called the assertion of Mr. Jefferson that all men are born free and equal as, quote, merely a rhetorical flourish. Noting abolitionists' adoption of the document, this writer claimed that upon this preposition, false as it is, rest the wild theories of liberty held by so many. So it's really clear to Southerners how abolitionists are using the Declaration, how central it is to their arguments. For abolitionists, tying their movement to the Declaration and to the founding was a key part of their attempts to persuade their fellow Americans. It also shows us that ultimately the sectional politics of slavery in the 19th century shaped how many Americans thought about the Revolution and vice versa. And while these sentiments by abolitionists might seem strange to some 21st century Americans who see hypocrisy as the defining feature of the Declaration, they do reveal something about abolitionists' deep connection to the founding and their desire to see themselves as the direct descendants of the Revolution and the rightful keepers of its legacy. Now, as a result, it was very much the abolitionists who laid the foundation for how many Americans would understand the meaning of the Declaration going forward and down to the present day. But abolitionists were not equally enamored with the Constitution. The posthumous publication of James Madison's notes from the Constitutional Convention in 1840 really had a significant impact. Before that, Americans generally had little knowledge of what had happened in the convention. But Madison's notes made clear the compromises that had been made regarding slavery, and many abolitionists, including Garrison, came to see the Constitution as the slaveholders' most powerful tool for protecting slavery. And over the course of the 1840s, Garrison and others came to believe that abolition could never happen under the Constitution, and they began embracing a position they called disunionism, which basically called for the free states to secede from the Union. And no union with slavery was their rallying cry. Now, the most dramatic expression of this disdain for the Constitution came when Garrison spoke on July 4th, 1854, at the Grove in Framingham, Massachusetts. On the day, he concluded or culminated one of his pro-abolition speeches by first holding up a copy of the Fugitive Slave Act from 1850 and setting it on fire as the crowd cheered. And then he dramatically pulled a copy of the Constitution out of his pocket, held it up, and then also set the Constitution alight to the cheers of the crowd as he declared it what he said was a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. He set the Constitution aflame to raucous applause from the abolitionist crowd. Now, throughout the 1850s, Southerners continued to dismiss the Declaration as mere rhetoric and really prioritized the Constitution as the most important document of the Revolution, and seeing it as really the most fundamental expression of the Revolution's ideals. This dynamic in which liberals see the Declaration as the defining founding document and conservatives see the Constitution in that sense really would remain a key part of the dynamic of the popular memory of the Revolution well into the 21st century. Now, a key watershed moment in how Americans understood and fought over the Declaration specifically came when Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address in November of 1863. By the time that he steps onto this makeshift platform in southern Pennsylvania, the war was more clearly becoming about ending slavery, and as a result, in Lincoln's mind, the war had turned into a war about these two revolutionary first principles, liberty and equality. So when Lincoln spoke the words, "A nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal," he was very much defining liberty and equality as the first principles of the revolution and of the nation. But he's also defining those terms in the way that abolitionists basically defined those terms since the 1830s. But by the end of the 19th century, the meanings of those two revolutionary principles would come to change quite radically, because not everyone agreed on exactly what liberty or equality meant, or on how much liberty or equality different types of Americans should enjoy. Conservatives in the late 19th century found a way to adopt the first principle of liberty for themselves by redefining it as the liberty of the individual. For those who wanted in the late 19th century to get the federal government out of the South during Reconstruction, or say during the Gilded Age, corporate elites who wanted to keep the federal government from breaking up their monopolies and regulating labor, individual liberty came to mean, in no small part, being free from the reach of the government, right? But like in the 18th century, there was also a distinct racial component to this new definition of liberty. It included the freedom to discriminate, right, which remains a part of how many Americans continue to understand individual liberty. But it also included the belief that the American idea of liberty was an inheritance not from the Declaration of Independence, but from the Anglo-Saxon race, and that it had been passed down to its white descendants in the United States. So in other words, liberty was not something that, liberty was something that was created by these ancient Anglo-Saxons, and as a result was owned and rightly controlled by white Americans of the purest English descent. Now, on the other side of the political spectrum, equality begins to change as well, and for what we would today think of as liberals, though the way they used these terms in the late 19th century is quite different from how we use them today. So equality retains a precedence for liberals in the late 19th century, but there are newer public struggles over gender with the suffragist movement, over ethnic inequalities given the rise of immigration during the 1890s and after, and also the growing economic inequalities of the Gilded Age. So all of these are sort of added to the fight for racial equality that originally defined the term as used by Lincoln. Now, to take it back to the Gettysburg Address, the historian Gary Wills has sort of famously argued about the Gettysburg Address in this way. He says that by accepting the Gettysburg Address and its concept of a single people dedicated to a proposition, we have been changed. Because of it, we live in a different America. But I want to suggest that the significance of the Gettysburg Address was really not in creating some kind of national consensus around the meaning of those terms or around the meaning of the United States, so much as it set the terms on which the revolution would be contested going forward, particularly in the 20th century. So on that day in 1863, Lincoln posited liberty and equality as the two first principles of the revolution. But in the decades after, as I've showed, those principles would quickly come to be seen as being in opposition to one another, in direct opposition to one another. Lincoln obviously did not intend that, but what he did was he actually laid the foundation for one of the most critical conflicts over the memory of the revolution in the 20th century between conservatives who defined liberty, meaning freedom from the government, as the revolution's first principle, and liberals who valued equality as its highest ideal. There was never a single people. There was never a single proposition. That proposition for Wills is the revolutionary ideals of liberty and equality, but defined by who? So there's never been agreement amongst Americans what the first principles are and which are the most important. In a sense, we do live in a different America because of the Gettysburg Address, but not because it created universal agreement, but because it set the terms by which Americans in the 20th century would fight over the revolution. Now, in the early 20th century, as sectionalism no longer defined the two main political parties, new conflicts emerged between progressives and what we would think of as conservatives in each party. Both parties had these two sort of wings, and that would build off this foundation of the set by the Gettysburg Address. Now, the progressives, they would come to argue that the Constitution needed to be treated as not as a mechanical or sort of Newtonian device, which is how people in the 18th century thought about it, but as a living document, or a Darwinian, in a Darwinian sense, right? This is a part of sort of modernizing the revolution for the 20th century. In other words, basically, they were arguing for what we now call the living Constitution, or the idea that the Constitution has to change with the times. Charles Beard, who is pictured there, was a well-known controversial progressive historian, and in his very famous book from 1913, which was called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, Beard basically argued that the Constitution was a product of the founders' own self-interest, that they voted during the Constitutional Convention based on what kind of wealth they had, whether it was wealth from land or whether it was wealth from other sources. And this book caused an enormous controversy in 1913, also because it depicted the Constitution as a counter-revolution by elites against the democratic forces that had been unleashed by the revolution. Progressive newspapers praised Beard quite heavily for showing that, quote, not a single man in the convention represented the small farmers, the working classes, or the propertyless masses. The paper concluded that Beard's book literally annihilates the old-time tradition that the Constitution is a sort of sacred chair of liberty and justice written by unselfish patriots gifted with little less than divine wisdom. And the Duluth News Tribune praised Beard for showing, quote, that the Constitution of the United States was not the voice of the people as we believed it to be, but was in reality framed to favor the capitalists and the landowners. Conservative newspapers responded in the quite opposite way. A headline in the Kalamazoo Gazette screamed, quote, famous professor says Constitution is work of crooks. The Ohio Star headline read, scavengers, hyena-like, desecrate the graves of the dead patriots we revere. Beard and his fellow progressives depicted the revolution as having been defined by class conflict, not grand ideas about liberty and self-government. And they reduced the founders from demigods to mere politicians out for their own self-interest. Conservatives at the time responded quite vehemently to Beard. They claimed that progressives wanted to defame, belittle, and humiliate the founders in an attempt to delegitimize the revolution and fundamentally change the nation that they created. That may sound familiar, right? The conservatives responded to this, what they perceived to be an attack on the memory of the revolution, by recommitting themselves to celebrating the founders. It's in the 1910s, shortly after Beard's book appears, that the term founding fathers is coined, and recommitting themselves to the Constitution, but with something of a new meaning. In the early 20th century, conservatives begin reinterpreting the Constitution not just as a sort of a commitment to the status quo, which is basically what it meant up until then, but as a document whose fundamental first principle was limited government, or small government, is a common term used. Now, this idea is, in the 20th century, is frequently traced back to Thomas Jefferson and his administration, but his administration really did little to undo the policies of the Federalists who preceded him. And of course, the Jefferson administration vastly expanded the size of the United States and, as a result, the federal government. Many Southerners in the 19th century, before the Civil War, they did not see Jefferson as a proponent of small government. They saw him as the person who began the expansion of democracy. And they believed that democracy was what was leading directly to these threats to slavery in the 1830s, 1840s. So Jefferson was not in great favor amongst many Southerners before the Civil War. Now, many people might also argue that states' rights arguments by the Southern states was a pre-Civil War example of small government ideology, but Southern states really were more than happy to use the power of an active federal government when it came to protecting or expanding slavery, if we think of the Fugitive Slave Act and other legislation like that. And besides, public acceptance of states' rights as a cause for the Civil War was primarily a product of the creation of the lost cause narrative, which was created by Southerners in the late 19th century to basically justify the Civil War, justify secession, and to deny that protecting slavery was the primary motivation for secession. Now, during the Gilded Age, the growing power of business supported what were called laissez-faire policies, right? So this is a genuine sort of hands-off type of approach by the government, but it really was specifically about the economy, right? And it was primarily in response to increasing unionization and growing public support for breaking up monopolies. So while there's always been a tradition of some sort of wanting to keep the federal government from doing specific things, it's really not until the early 20th century that conservatives create the modern memory of the Constitution by arguing that the Constitution was created, that the intention of the Constitution was to create a small and inactive federal government, right? Now, there's a dissonance there, right? Because we know that the whole purpose of the Constitutional Convention was to create a more powerful centralized government than the Articles of Confederation. But in popular memory, those kinds of dissonances can often be ignored or papered over quite easily. That's just how memory works. Now, this specific term that I use, limited government, that would not become common really until the 1940s and 1950s. But this idea of, or ideal of an inactive government as a first principle of the Constitution and the Revolution really gains wider popularity only in the 1910s and the 1920s. And if you think about the context, it's following the rise of progressivism, which is calling for a more active federal government. It's following especially the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. This is a significant threat to conservatives in the United States. Following opposition to wartime price controls by President Wilson, and then the subsequent Red Scare. So in other words, conservatives of both parties really doubled down on tying their ideal of an inactive government to the revolution as a direct counter to the rise of communism in Russia, to World War I, and to the growth of progressivism and socialism at home. And they saw the Constitution as a sort of bulwark against the rise of what they called un-American radicalism. And this had been a sort of concern ever since the rise of immigration during the 1890s. And that's when we get sort of the rise of these conservative patriotic groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution. And in the 1920s, after all of these events that I just mentioned, these patriotic societies create education programs for immigrants to teach them about what they called true Americanism, which basically meant, an appreciation for the Constitution, for law and order, and the status quo. They promoted bills in most states that ended up passing requiring that high school students learn about the Constitution that had not been required before in many states. And this is also, it's also only in the 1920s that most states have laws requiring students to attend through 12th grade. That's why this fights over education, over curriculum, over textbook controversies. We start to see that in the 1920s, really for the first time, and that's an important part of the context why. They started controversies over textbooks that they believed were not patriotic enough in how they depicted the Constitution and the founders. That should sound familiar. So by the 1920s, conservatives were all in for the Constitution, and they remained quite skittish about identifying with the Declaration as a document that declared all men are created equal. But what idea they do come up with in the 1920s is the idea of rugged individualism, right? That is, that idea really takes flower in the 1920s. And it's also when they start to, though this takes a while to sort of gain steam, but it's at this time that they start to make the case that individual liberty was one of the first principles of the Declaration. So no longer is it just the product of the Anglo-Saxon race. Now they're tying it directly to the Declaration, and it's going to allow conservatives, almost for the first time, to be able to identify with the Declaration in any meaningful way. In fact, by 1934, James Truslow Adams observed that the phrase rugged individualism had so caught on that it had become, especially to conservatives, quote, almost as moving as all men are created equal. But this reading of the Declaration as being about individual liberty would not catch on fully until the onset of the Cold War in the 1950s. And I think that that's in part because if you think about the 1930s and 40s and the challenges the nation was facing, they were very much sort of collective challenges, right? The Great Depression, World War II. So in the 1950s, faced with what was perceived as an existential threat to the nation, it was necessary for the United States to clearly define themselves, to define what Americanism meant. And it was also clear that the memory of the revolution would be an important part of this process and of the efforts to win the Cold War. But creating a memory of the revolution that would distinguish the United States from the communist Soviet Union required sort of displacing this old progressive memory of the revolution because it was primarily about class conflict between the interests of elites and non-elites. And, that made sense in the 1930s during the Depression. But, by the 1950s, in the context of the Cold War and rabid anti-communism, the progressive interpretation seemed much more communist than American, right? This focus on class conflict. And so, in other words, for conservatives especially, the revolution needed to be Americanized for the Cold War. And over the course of the 1950s, a new, unprecedentedly popular conservative memory of the revolution was created that defined the nation and the revolution by three principles: individual liberty, limited government, and free enterprise, or capitalism. And it's no coincidence that each of those stood in stark contrast to the social, political, and economic systems of the Soviet Union, right? It was a key part of Americans' Cold War rhetoric that no liberty or freedom could exist in the Soviet Union because the collective mattered more than the individual. In contrast to the Soviet Union's expansive bureaucracy, the US government was limited by its constitution and the belief that smaller government was better government. And finally, American capitalism as a free market economic system stood in stark contrast to the Soviet Union's centrally planned economy. And by defining these conservative principles as products of the revolution rather than ideas picked up along the way, they could be portrayed as first principles and part of the nation's DNA in a way that just seemed to make sense to many Americans, especially within the conservative political culture of the 1950s. But most importantly, this new conservative Cold War memory of the revolution reconciled the Declaration and the Constitution in popular memory to an unprecedented degree. So for more than a century before, liberals had seen the Declaration and its statement of human equality as defining the revolution, and conservatives had defined the revolution by the Constitution. But by the early years of the Cold War, conservatives had popularly reinterpreted the key principle of the Declaration as individual liberty, and this allowed them to argue that the key principle of the Constitution, limited government, was intended to secure the first principle of the Declaration, which was individual liberty. These two founding documents had, for more than a century before, seemed different, if not opposite, but in the 1950s came to appear as if they were not only of a piece, but that they went hand in hand with one another. And so this memory of the revolution, this conservative Cold War memory of the revolution, really became predominant and quite quickly. In fact, it continued to be persuasive to the public and produced political results for the conservative Republican Party long after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union itself had ceased to exist. Now, as more and more time passed, the memory's specific origins were forgotten or obscured, and many subsequent generations simply came to believe that this was how Americans have always understood the revolution, and that any suggestions otherwise were subversive acts of quote-unquote historical revisionism. Even now, well into the 21st century, this Cold War memory continues to define how many Americans, especially conservative Americans, understand the meaning and legacy of the revolution. Meanwhile, the modern liberal approach to the revolution has its origins in what I call the long bicentennial era, which stretched from about 1970 to 1989. And in the late 1960s, there's a new generation of young social historians who were informed by the civil rights movement and other social movements. They continued the progressive tradition of busting myths from the traditional narrative and treating the elite leaders of the revolution with a skepticism. But during the bicentennial era, their work combined with countless efforts by activist minority groups who determined to use the bicentennial as an opportunity to expose the white American public to their roles in American history, which had long been ignored in traditional histories and textbooks. Before the civil rights movement, white Americans, including many liberals, could see their experience and those of their ancestors as the story of the United States. By the bicentennial, this parochial sense of historical consensus really was shattered for many Americans. Representation of minority groups, especially in history education, became an important issue in the 1960s, And by the 1970s, many high schools and colleges taught at least some African American and Native American history. American students were exposed to more accurate and detailed accountings of the realities of oppression experienced by African Americans and Native Americans. And as a result, it was becoming increasingly difficult for white Americans to ignore the contradictions and failures of the revolution. It became harder for white Americans to ignore that the author of the Declaration of Independence was also one of the colony's largest enslavers of human beings. And it became more difficult for the public to ignore the historical role of minority groups and, by extension, the importance of slavery and dispossession in the nation's history. And so the bicentennial really marks the first time that a major national commemoration could not simply take a white-only historical narrative for granted. As a result, the bicentennial provided the platform for what I think was a quite radical shift in Americans' historical consciousness. Critiques of the treatment of specific groups in American history became much more common in political discourse, in mainstream media, and in popular culture in the years after the bicentennial than they had ever been before. And while conservatives and many elites sought to commercialize and mythologize the revolution for the bicentennial, many others fought to pierce the veil of the white-only American history that had been predominant for 200 years. And in doing so, they offered a challenge both to that traditional white narrative of the revolution and also to the conservative Cold War memory. And ultimately, I want to argue that the bicentennial served as a springboard for the process of forging more inclusive and accurate popular memories of the revolution and of American history generally, and the conflicts that would emerge out of that process in the decades to come. So just to conclude, today our fights over the American Revolution, I think, are still very much defined by these developments from the previous century. Conservatives continue to largely subscribe to the Cold War memory and its ideals of individual liberty, limited government, and capitalism, while liberals continue to prioritize equality as the nation's most important first principle, and at least since the bicentennial era, they continue to see diversifying the popular memory of the revolution as a way of working to achieve that principle politically. And since the early 20th century, conservatives continue to define patriotism by the celebration of the elite founders, founding fathers, while liberals continue to define patriotism as trying to more fully realize the revolution's first principle of equality. In other words, how we think and fight about the revolution in our contemporary political culture has very deep roots in American history itself. And I hope that you will take away from this talk the realization that how we think about and fight over the revolution has changed over time, and that those changes are always shaped by contemporary circumstances. And also the takeaway that there is no one single memory of the American Revolution. Americans have always fought over defining what the revolution means. And finally, to take away that reimagining the revolution, like our past generally, really is a long-standing American political tradition across the partisan spectrum. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions.
Hi. I was wondering if you could go back and talk. I'm sorry. I was wondering if you could go back and talk about the posthumous publication of Madison's papers and that incident, because I never knew anything about that before. And I was kind of curious if you could go into that a little bit more in detail.
Yeah, so Madison's notes, Madison kept his notes of the convention and always planned from the convention on until he died that he would not allow them to be published until after he was dead. And he kept that promise for, over almost 50 years, or just over 50 years. There is a recent, very interesting recent book called Madison's Hand, which actually shows, by looking at the actual manuscript, that shows that Madison actually made changes to his notes, like throughout the years after, like over the 5 decades after. So it's not a, it's not a verbatim transcript of the convention. There had been, one or two others had kept partial notes during the convention, and they had been published, but they were very selective. And when Madison made provisions for when he died that the Library of Congress would buy his manuscript and publish it. So when it was actually published as the papers of James Madison, not as the notes on the Constitutional Convention, which is what we call it today. But what's important about that is that, people from the time of the convention through the first 75 years of the nation really had no idea what had gone on in the convention. And that was by design, right? The founders at the convention had been basically had a gag rule, right, in place, so that the proceedings would not be revealed, certainly during the convention, but even for a long time after. And abolitionists in the 1830s, a lot of them thought that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document, but some, like Garrison and others, thought that suspected strongly that there had been significant compromises made during the convention. And when Madison's notes are published, it very much confirms that. And if you see back to the cover of this book here, Wendell Phillips, who was a noted abolitionist, he published this. This is a later edition, but he published this just a year or two after Madison's notes are published, and basically he pulls out all of the parts of the notes that deal with compromises over slavery, to basically say, look, this proves, Madison's notes prove that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document. And in some sense, we're still having that debate today. There are American historians who are arguing right now about whether the Constitution was a pro-slavery document or not, Sean Lentz among them. So that is a debate that goes directly back to the abolitionists and to the publication of Madison's notes in 1840.
Thank you.
So based on everything you talked about with the bicentennial, what do you think is going to happen in the next few years with the 250th? I know it's probably a loaded question, but.
Well, if being a historian should teach a person anything, it's that a historian cannot predict the future. But I'm very struck after I'm basically I'm just finishing the book manuscript now, and the book will be out in 2024. I'm struck by just how deeply rooted the ways that we fight about the revolution today, how deeply rooted the beliefs are, and even the practices in the way that we fight about them, So I don't see that especially, I don't see that changing, especially, certainly not drastically. I mean, one of the things that I've noticed by covering this history in such a long spell is that there's always a significant growth in interest of the revolution around these major anniversaries, whether it's the Jubilee in 1826, the Centennial in 1876. The 150th in 1926 is kind of a is kind of an aberration, because it was not really, it was not a big deal, basically. The reason I think for that is because in 1926, the nation was kind of riding an economic high, and there was a good level of political stability. But if you think about those other periods, 1826, 1876, so we're talking about the end of Reconstruction, the onset of the Gilded Age. If we think about 1976, there's lots of turmoil there of all kinds. And so, you know, if existing turmoil is a driver of interest around these anniversaries, I think we could safely maybe predict that a little bit.
I'll ask another question on kind of building on that. Given that so much of the conversation historically has been really amongst kind of white-dominated narratives, how do you see, or how can we find ground in the 250th to prioritize those voices that kind of had those kind of breakthrough moments in the bicentennial but didn't have kind of equal footing with those kind of nostalgic, conservative?
Yeah, I want to be careful about not over-suggesting that that there was a grand success in that area during the bicentennial, right? It was very much laying the foundation or planting the seeds, right? And I think, you know, it's since the bicentennial, we have seen a dramatic increase in the diversification of popular memory around the Revolution, but around American history generally, right? But of course, the traditional all-white narrative was so entrenched for 200 years, right, that there's still a long way to go, even after 50 years of having finally made some kind of breakthrough during the bicentennial. So, you know, I think that there's a lot, there's a much longer way to go. And, you know, sometimes I'm a little dismayed about the way that we talk about the diversification of our popular memory, whether of the Revolution or American history generally, as if the last 50 years hadn't happened, right? And we're kind of starting from scratch now, right? I think, you know, the best way to go forward is to recognize and build on what's happened in the past, right? Not to ignore it or downplay it, and seem like you're the first one on the scene. You know what I mean? So, you know, I think, you know, there was a lot of astounding work done during the 1970s by African-American activists. In fact, because of the bicentennial, there was a dramatic increase in public funding and recognition for public history projects related to African-American history. That's when the Black Freedom Trail, for example, in Boston is an example of that. Tremendous work by Native American activists to try to get their histories in front of the public through mainstream media, through testifying in Congress, and in all kinds of ways. And, you know, that work needs to be honored, and it needs to be built on. And so, you know, I think, you know, pushing forward that, you know, just like trying to achieve equality for many people is the sort of, is seen as a way of, let's say, honoring the revolutionary legacy, right, by trying to better achieve that revolutionary ideal. I think it works the same way, you know, for pushing for an ever more equal perspective on our national history.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. This is a fascinating and timely discussion as we, you know, gear up planning for the 250th. I just want to make a couple comments and then maybe ask a question as well. I think it's very interesting how you outline how, you know, the revolution has been, for lack of a better term, politicized, really since the beginning. And I'm interested in your thoughts on this kind of narrative that exists in the field of history about not politicizing the past and somehow, approaching the past in a completely subjective manner, and how that would work. And then I would follow that up with a kind of sort of a different tact. But what you're saying about the bicentennial is very interesting to me. I've been maybe over-focusing on what it didn't do. But it's clear to me that in listening to you and some of the other knowledge I have, that it did go a long way in changing the narrative, certainly from the 150th. In New York, at least, the 150th was completely celebratory in every way. But I'm curious too, and this would be my second question, so I apologize. But I'm curious in your book that's coming out, if you, when you were talking about the bicentennial, if you looked much at the People's Bicentennial program. So I assume you did. So.
Yeah. So if you're unfamiliar, the People's Bicentennial Commission was a fascinating group, a liberal socialist group, basically, formed in 1970 to basically offer a more radical, popular take on the revolution, and to tie the ideals of, they were not, let's say, openly socialist. The PBC, which is how they're often referred to, basically framed their efforts around a concern over the rising influence of corporations, right, and big business. And so, they tied their anti-big business cause directly to the revolution. There's lots of ways to do that, and not just by quoting Thomas Paine. And what's interesting about them is, because they were not openly socialist, and because lots of Americans in the early 1970s, as the economic prosperity of the post-war era was really sort of winding down, or starting to show its first cracks. A lot of Americans, both conservative and liberal, were having, some concerns over, the rise of these big corporations, not unlike during the Gilded Age. And so they built on that, they drew on that, and because they were not so explicitly partisan, they were usually successful. Like the success of the People's Bicentennial Commission is one of the most interesting stories to come out of the bicentennial in some sense. They published all kinds of pamphlets and all kinds of publications, and that they sent around that were being used by churches and schools all across the country, in the Midwest and the South even. And it got so bad for that Nixon and Republicans in Congress held a series of hearings to basically to alert the American people to the hidden agenda of the PBC. And in fact, they held a series of hearings that they called the attempt to steal the bicentennial. The PBC was attempting to steal the bicentennial. Of course, implicit in that is the notion that Nixon's Republican Party owned the bicentennial, right? That conservatives own the revolution in a sense, right? And that's a product of the Cold War memory. And so the PBC provided one of the first and biggest challenges to that Cold War memory by saying, the revolution was not about limited government, or individual liberty. It's about collective liberty. It's about an active government trying to work for the betterment of the people. So the PBC is this really interesting case. The other question, I think, was about objectivity. Historians are, I think that whole debate about, objective history, of course, when you try to challenge a traditional narrative or an entrenched popular memory like the Cold War memory has been for the last 70 years, you hear proponents of that memory, cry out about historical revisionism, right? These new people are trying to revise the past that you know, and you should be worried about that, right? But I hope that, my first book delves into the politics of memory during the revolution itself. But, what I've talked about today, I hope makes clear, that there is no one accepted history or memory for that matter, right? Every generation of Americans makes their own meaning for the revolution based on their current circumstances, based on their political goals. But what I would say about that too is that it's our view on whether history is supposed to be objective or subjective. Most historians know it can't be objective. There's no such thing as an objective historian, right? But it's kind of been the way that we talk about history and the public has kind of been skewed ever since the late 19th century because of the rise of the academic profession of history, right? That came up with these standards that it argued were superior in determining what the past was about. And even though as we move through the 20th century, historians acknowledge there's no such thing as an objective historian. All historians are embedded in their own context, and that affects not just how they see the past, but the questions that they ask, right? But even though that's been, increasingly accepted by historians, there's still, it gets complicated when they still try to make the argument that there's something about their methodology, say, that makes their history better than, say, popular history, or that's just a tension that has existed for half a century or more. But the thing that's interesting about it is that we think about like the difference between academic history, which is very dry and jargon laden and not accessible, versus popular history, which is accessible but maybe not very substantive, and maybe overly celebratory. Nobody talked about history like that until the mid to late 20th century. Before that, it was understood that there was no such thing as objective history, and that the present affected history. That was just a given in the 19th century, basically. But it shows how the ways that we go about creating history, whether it's through the creation of a profession or whatnot, has a distinct impact on how we think about the past, how we relate to the past. So, there's a structural, there's a structural change in there that means that we talk about history here in the 21st century often in very different ways than they did in the past. Yeah. Yep.
More a comment than a question.
Yeah.
I think that you did a great job in past and prologue in
Thank you.
demonstrating that memory itself is revisionist, and I think that current studies in memory theory clearly demonstrate that there is no such thing as an or phenomenon that memory preserves somehow. Every time it's prevailed upon, it changes that memory. And why would anybody write history if they weren't going to write revisionist history? We wouldn't need any more history if it was right to begin with.
Well, I mean, that's true. But I mean, if you think about it, the idea for people who criticize historical revisionism, the idea there is that the first history they learned must have been the right history, right? That any history that says anything different after the fact is a problem, is wrong, or is even sinister even. But, part of that is derived from the way that they think about memory generally. So if you think about this, let's look at this Cold War memory, the conservative Cold War memory. So much of its authority is based on the idea that that is how the founders themselves thought about the revolution, that the founders thought individual liberty and limited government were what the revolution was about, right? It's just implicit in the way that they talk about it, as if there's a direct through line from the way that the founders thought to the way that they think in the present, right? And that's been the case from, since the beginning of that memory in the 1950s right down to the present. And so that's reflective of the whole revisionist dynamic, right? That there is an original of something, right? And that you, not them, have a direct connection to it, right? And that's part of its legitimacy. That's part of its authority.
That's compatible with their thinking about science in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah. I mean, and politics generally, yeah. Yeah. That's a big part of what I try to do in this manuscript, soon to be book, which is, to find those connections between how people in a given time, think about the past and how it's shaped by their contemporary context, but also the ways they think about other things, and surprisingly so, that usually there's connections like that to be found, because we even if sometimes we might say lots of incoherent things, usually there's some level of coherent function, the way people think politically, So yeah, that's a really good point.
Okay. Maybe it's a quick one because I don't know if there's an answer, but have you found any parallels internationally with other countries and their founding principles and how they're remembered?
Yeah, so I have not done that, though I do know at least one person who is working on, like the history of let's say, a specific founder outside of the United States, I did not do any sort of direct comparison in that way, but that would be a fascinating project, or a series of essays, because, I think there's a lot there. I think one of the things that I was struck about was that, the way that these origin myths are used, or were used in the ancient period, they were, the meaning that they were supposed to, convey about the origins of whatever, Rome or Athens, or, was generally relatively clear and understood. It wasn't contested in the way that we contest the meaning of the revolution. And one of the things I find fascinating about it is that, you would think that because the revolution was, in historical terms, relatively recent, and was so well documented, right, that maybe it would be harder to be contestable, And in fact, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson thought that as time went on, Americans would actually know less about what had happened during the Revolution. They did not anticipate, the development of historical preservation movements and things like that. They thought that the few documents they thought that existed, would likely would diminish or disappear entirely, and so people would know less about the revolution over time. But that has not happened, and yet we still fight about it. So really, it almost plays no role in the fact that we fight about the revolution as much as we do, that it's so relatively recent and documented. Someone else?
Picking off of this gentleman's answer down here, I picked one thing out of it. I'm going to twist it on you. what do you think the founders would say about today?
You got me. So one of the things, I find the fact that Americans ask that question just absolutely fascinating, because, I mean, other historians have made it this point, but like, people in England don't do that, you know? People in other countries don't really do that. It's kind of a distinct phenomenon here. But the question is just largely unanswerable, because there is no quote unquote founders, right? That when conservatives in the early 20th century coined the term founding fathers, right? Part of what they're doing is they're canonizing a certain number of founders, right? By calling them founding fathers, they're also creating this familial hierarchy, right? Whereas, you know, if the founders are fathers, then the citizens are children, and, you know, how do you honor your parents? By obeying them, right? The founding fathers know best, right? You know, there's just so much, there's so much variation among the founding generation that when people use that term, the founders, you know, it's not just reductionist, but usually there's a point to the reductionism, right? Usually there's a political point to that kind of reductionism. You know, is when you say the founders, are you talking about Thomas Paine, you know, or are you talking about, I mean, just when people say the founders or founding fathers, you know, just in relation to the Constitutional Convention, well, you know, there were lots of opinions in the Constitutional Convention, you know. So I think, you know, when you hear people, when you hear, you know, someone in sort of media or popular culture, you know, using that term in a way that is clearly sort of uncritical, you know, that should be like a red flag, you know, from my perspective, from a memory perspective, because there's all kinds of assumptions that are embedded in the use of that term, and that's what, as I just described. So yeah, I think that I think you know, if you could pull a Bill and Ted, you know, I think that I think you would find a wide range of opinions among the founders, because the founders had a wide range of opinions. So. Any more? Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate it.